This is the Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well podcast. I'm Lisa Salisbury, and this is episode 129, Nutrient-Based Eating with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. Welcome to Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well, the podcast for busy women who want to lose weight without constantly counting, tracking, or stressing over every bite. I'm Lisa Salisbury, a certified health, weight loss, and life coach, and most importantly, a recovered chronic dieter. Here, you'll learn to listen to your body and uncover the reasons you're reaching for food when you're not truly hungry, freeing you to focus on a healthier, more fulfilling approach to eating. Before we dive into our episode with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, I wanted to remind you that for the month of January, I have a special promotion on my Jumpstart Your Weight Loss program. If you are a woman who wants to feel confident inside and out, who's tired of dieting, and feeling like you're on that hamster wheel of yo-yo, binging, restricting, all of the different metaphors, you likely also wrestle with feelings of shame around eating, you are the perfect fit for this program. I want to get you started right this year with this Jumpstart Your Weight Loss. Check the link in the show notes for all the details. But in a nutshell, this is a 90-minute intensive one-on-one coaching session that's going to be tailored to your exact needs. You'll leave with a plan that will get you going on your weight loss and health goals and set you up for success this year. Check that link in the show note again for all the details. One more thing about before we chat with Dr. Sarah, we had so much to talk about that we ended up splitting our conversation into two parts. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss next week's episode that gets into more about weight loss and how the nutritional strategies that we discussed today are directly related. Okay, let's get into this conversation with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. Welcome back to the Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well podcast. I am so delighted to have Dr. Sarah Ballantyne here with us today. She is a PhD and the founder of Nutrivore.com and the New York Times bestselling author of Nutrivore, The Radical New Science of Getting the Nutrients You Need from the Food You Eat. She creates tons of educational resources for people to help improve their day-to-day diet and lifestyle choices. And I'm going to stop reading the bio because I just want to say, all you need to know is this book is now required reading for my clients. Like, it is so good. It is so good. So, Dr. Sarah, welcome to the show. And if there's anything in your bio you want to add to, please do and introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I don't know if there's anything to add. I'm a huge nerd. That is will become evident very shortly. I'm a huge nerd of the nutritional sciences variety. That's the only thing I would add.
Okay, perfect. I know you're an avid hiker as well. I see you on Instagram hiking and doing videos for us in the morning. So, where do you live that you can hike year-round?
I live in North Georgia, but I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, actually the west coast of Canada, where if you don't go out when it's raining, you don't leave the house for 6 months of the year. And so I am just an all-weather outdoorsy person. The key to being an all-weather outdoorsy person is just having the right gear. It's like layers and knowing when you need to stay dry. And I actually really love, especially really, really cold mornings or rainy mornings, because in Georgia, I would say the average person is a fair weather outdoorsy person, not an all weather outdoorsy person. So I get the entire miles and miles and miles of trail system all to myself. If the weather's even slightly off 80 degrees and sunny. So I love it. I actually value my rainy day walks even more than my sunny day walks.
Perfect. I love it. All right. Well, let's jump into talking about nutrients. So fun, right?
I think so. I could talk about nutrients all day, every day. Actually, I do talk about nutrients all day, every day. But that's where my life fulfillment comes from. So I feel like my top level is nutrients are the most fundamental component of nutrition, right? Like nutrition, nourishment, nutrients, they all have the same Latin root, right? They all it's nourishing us, right? Nutrients are the raw materials that our bodies need to do everything that our bodies do. They're the things that go into all the chemical reactions of life. There's 49 essential nutrients. hundreds of others that are technically non-essential, but extremely important for supporting overall health. And yet, diet culture teaches us, oh, we just need to count this one thing or cut
Calories.
out this one group of foods.
Yeah.
Right? Or, right, there's this one thing that we're gonna obsess calories or carb grams or whatever, right? We're gonna obsess over this one thing, or we're gonna cut out all of these things really to obsess over one thing still. And at no point do we actually learn, unless you seek a career in as like a nutritionist or a registered dietitian, do we learn the basics of nutritional sciences, right? If you think about how much do we know about math?
Well, you said in your book, like, what if high school students took the same amount of nutrition studies as they did math or a language? Like, why isn't nutrition studies one of the sciences offered along with biology and physics?
So my oldest is about to graduate high school, and my youngest is a ninth grader. And their nutrition that they get is a 1 week unit in the middle of their health course, which is a half
Yeah.
class, right? So like health is
Mhm.
half and PE is half. They have to take that once over their entire high school degree, and basically all they learn is my plate. So they don't learn about, they kind of learn this, like, this is junk food, right? They learn a moralization of foods through this. This is junk food. These are the 4 things you put in your plate and what you pour in your glass, right? Very, like, too basic to actually be useful. And it actually, I think, makes us more susceptible to diet culture, right? I think,
It
um
definitely does. Here in California, they make in that unit in health, they make them count calories and do a full food journal for a week. And I told my girls not to do it. I was like,
Yeah.
we're not doing that. You're not at 16 or 14, whenever they took that. You're not going to count calories. And it was, I mean, what one of my daughters came home and she was like, you would have died, mom. It was like, welcome to having an eating disorder in that class because of the way they were talking about calories. And so yeah, high school students don't get it, and they don't get enough, and so that's why books like yours are so valuable to, I mean, to high school students as well as to, any age. We can improve at any age, and that's one of the things I bookmarked in your book was that if you started on a more nutrient-dense diet in your 20s, you added, like, 13 years of life,
Yeah.
but if you start in your 60s, you still add 8 years, and if you
Yeah.
start in your 80s, still, what is it, 3 years? I think
3.4 years.
3.4
Yeah.
years, like, it's never too late to make a difference. So, of course, we want our kids to know these things, but in our learning them, most of my listeners are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and so they do have teenagers at home. It's time to start teaching them and focusing on the nutrients, and I bookmarked several statistics, but one that's really incredible is there's 4 essential nutrients for which 90% or more of people don't get enough of,
Yeah.
and 10 essential nutrients for which half or more people do not get enough of. Like, we're literally just not eating enough nutrients. And does anyone get it?
I'm sure there's somebody out there. I mean, the thing is like statistically, no, right? So, the top most common nutrient shortfall is vitamin D, and approximately 100% of people don't get enough dietary vitamin D. Now, vitamin D we can kind of put into its own little box because it is the only essential nutrient that we don't have to get from our diet. We can hypothetically make enough in our skin in response to sunlight if we spend enough time outdoors. But
With exposed unsunscreened skin.
using sunscreen will diminish the amount of vitamin D production, but it won't block it
Okay.
completely. So let's call it safe sun exposure. So either like non-sunblocked skin for a short enough period of time that we're not going to burn because sunburns still really are
Mhm.
bad, or a longer period of time using sunscreen
Okay.
will still
Perfect.
make vitamin D in that. So like what latitude you're at, what time of year it is, what the cloud cover is, how much melanin is in your skin, right? How much skin is exposed are all like factors that go into how much vitamin D we're producing. But the fact that we spend more time indoors on average, than we ever have in human history is the main contributor to the low vitamin D levels that are so rampant. So different studies estimate this differently, but something like 75% of Americans are deficient or insufficient in vitamin D. So those are all the people who could benefit from consuming more vitamin D and or discovering how amazing nature is. Ideally both, or taking a supplement, right? So I think
Mhm.
part of the challenges here, there's always like is an undercurrent whenever we talk about nutrition is we've got systemic challenges to overcome in addition to an educational barrier, in addition to all of the like misinformation that we're taught through diet culture, right? In addition to competing in terms of palatability between whole foods and ultra processed foods. Like there's layers of challenge here, and one of those challenges is access, right? One of those challenges is just how our modern lives are structured, how affordable, nutrient dense foods are or inaffordable they can be. And so with vitamin D specifically, we've got like that additional barrier, which is a lot of people have work schedules that don't allow them to spend time outside, or they don't live in an area where they have easy access to nature, or they don't live in an area where it's safe to go for a walk in their neighborhood in the afternoon, right? So we've got a lot of, or they don't have the mobility to go for a walk, right? Like there's lots of challenges.
When I have time for a walk, it's after dinner and it's dark.
Yeah. A good 3 months of the year, my walks start in the dark and I watch the sunrise. Um, so I go, first thing in the morning after breakfast before I start work. That's because I have a very high energy dog and she's a great dog when she's tired. So that is my first task of the day after coffee is to tire out my dog. But I've really like structured my life around carving out that time. But just as a like additional, as we're talking about vitamin D, like I always feel like there's so many layers to the vitamin D conversation, and that's obviously one of them. But the next most common nutrient shortfall is potassium. 97.8% of Americans don't get enough dietary potassium, and that's eating patterns. That is completely so that there's no like handful of foods that have so much potassium that if you just eat those foods every day, you'll get enough potassium. Potassium is a harder nutrient to get in the food supplies. We've got a lot of foods that have 10-ish% of the daily value of potassium per serving, right? Like a potato has 14%, a banana has 8%, a carrot
Yeah,
has
bananas aren't like the
9%.
powerhouse that we all everyone's like, "Oh, bananas for potassium." Like, I mean, they're
Yeah,
good, but
I
they're not
mean,
great.
if you wanna eat 6 bananas a day, sure. That gets you halfway to your potassium goals. Um, yeah, they're not I mean, they're great. Bananas are a nutritious food, but they're not the key to getting enough potassium. It's kinda like you
Right.
need to eat bananas and parsnips and canned tuna and yogurt and carrots and, some canned bamboo in your stir fry, right? Like, you kind of have to, like, layer all of the potassium-rich foods in order to get enough potassium. And you'll see, like, a lot of them are root vegetables. So,
Mm.
potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, parsnips, winter squash, and then we get, like, a layer out of, like, select other fruits and vegetables, right? It's like avocados, like, apricots are okay. Dried apricots are a particularly good source, but only because how a serving is defined. So a serving
Uh,
for dried
yeah,
apricots is defined as half a cup, but that's really, like, 2 cups
that's a lot of
almost. So it's more
apricots.
like 2
Yeah.
servings of apricots. Yeah, I mean, I would call that a good time. I love apricots and their effects, but that's not a good time for everyone. So, raisins are the same, right? They're a good source of potassium, but in part because of how a serving is defined for dried fruit. For
Mm.
some dried fruit, the fresh equivalent is more than a serving. So when you see something like raisins or dried apricots on a, good source of list, but you don't see grapes or fresh apricots, that's an artifact of serving definitions. So
Mm.
for potassium, it's just a harder food to get, and it's a harder food to get because the average vegetable consumption for Americans is 1.6 servings per day, and where most
Yikes.
science is at makes a case for 5 servings per day as a target for supporting long-term health. So it's just that it's that mismatch between how we eat on average and where the science points to as being the eating patterns that help us reach our short-term health goals, but also protect our long-term health. And the difference is nutrient intake, right? The difference is 98% of people not getting enough potassium versus if we could change even just the vegetable servings, that statistic would look very, very different.
I felt like most of the takeaway from the book was produce generally.
Mhm.
Fruits and vegetables, that's really the powerhouse of a lot of these nutrients. So, what happens though when we don't get enough? Like, what's the danger? Because there's a little bit like, oh my gosh, like I was a little overwhelmed with how many things I'm not eating. And I cook from scratch on the daily, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And then I'm thinking, well, what's going to happen? Like, what would happen if I don't
Yeah,
do this?
so we're talking about nutrient insufficiency, right? Dietary shortfall of nutrients. And I think what's so insidious about nutrient insufficiency is there can be absolutely no signs, no
Mm.
symptoms whatsoever. So we're talking about this weird gray in between deficiency, regular dietary intake of an essential nutrient so low that it causes a disease of malnutrition, like scurvy from not getting enough vitamin
Mhm.
C. So somewhere between that level and the daily value, right? The recommended dietary intake. So how much our bodies actually need. So for vitamin C as an example, it only takes 10 milligrams of vitamin C per day to prevent scurvy. But the recommended dietary intake for adult females is 75 milligrams, and for adult males is 90 milligrams. So insufficiency is that space in between 10 milligrams and 75 or 90 milligrams. Every nutrient kind of has a similar kind of gray range where it's not enough to meet what our bodies need to function optimally, but it's enough to prevent deficiency, right? So it's enough to prevent a disease of malnutrition. So what happens in that weird gray is it puts like strain on the biological systems that need those nutrients. So we think of nutrients as like the raw materials that go into the chemical reactions of life. If you don't have the right raw materials for a chemical reaction that, say, the cardiovascular system relies upon, a couple of different things can happen, right? So we can shift to a different biochemical pathway that's maybe not quite as good. We might get a biochemical like byproduct produced that's maybe toxic or inflammatory, or we might not produce as much of the product as we actually need. So all of the ways that our bodies kind of accommodate a lack of resources, it's all strain, it's all wear and tear. It's like driving a car with plenty of gas, right? We got all the calories we need, we put all the energy into the car, but we don't have very much oil or brake fluid, right? So it's like these other things that the engine needs to run that we're going to be able to go out to the grocery store and be fine, right? We're going to be able to do that those couple of trips. But over time, that's going to cause wear and tear on the engine, right? It's going to eventually cause the engine to seize, right? And it's potentially going to interact with other things. So in health, where those other things would be genetics and epigenetics, our lifestyle, our health related behaviors, like whether or not we smoke or drink, social determinants of health. In the car, it might be how cold it is outside or whether or not there's salt on the road, right? Or if it's 120 degrees in the desert, right? These other things that put wear and tear on an engine. And eventually, those things all interact to cause the engine to break down or cause us to get into an accident, right? Like it's something else that was going to, right, be the development of chronic illness or the increased susceptibility to infection. So it's not a one-to-one. So a disease of malnutrition is directly caused by the low intake of that one essential nutrient. Insufficiency, it's a collection of insufficiencies that interact with all of these other inputs to our health that collectively increase our risk for chronic disease. But they increase our risk of every chronic disease other than heritable genetic diseases, right? And even some of those will still have interactions with nutrient intake in terms of the symptomology. So it is collectively increasing our risk without necessarily outward signs now, right? We could
Mm.
still do that quick trip out to the grocery store and the engine sounds fine. So we might not have any signs, or we might have really amorphous symptoms, right? Things that are really easy to just like explain away as, yeah, well, I'm stressed. I didn't sleep well last night. So I might have headaches, fatigue, brain fog, just poor mood, low resiliency to stress. We might have joint pain. Maybe our muscles don't recover very quickly after a workout, right? Like we might have just like a lack of motivation, right? So like all of these things can be signs of nutrient insufficiencies and still not one-to-one, still not like fatigue is always B vitamins or iron, right?
Mhm.
There's many nutrients that can, when we don't get enough, cause fatigue as a symptom. But rather it's this like collection of I just don't feel great, right?
Mhm.
Or I have no obvious signs, but over years and decades, those nutrient shortfalls increase the risk of a serious health problem, right? Something that's eroding quality of life that maybe makes it so that we can't work, that maybe causes, right, a large amount of medical bills or causes us to need a prescription. And it's not that it's not that improving nutrition is a guarantee because there are other things that are affecting our risk, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
genetics and social determinants of health and environmental exposures and lifestyle. But it is a really clear point of intervention, right? It is a really obvious place where we can tweak our day-to-day choices and dramatically change our risks of health problems in the future. It's not going to be 100%, but maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 80%, right? Depending on what we're talking about, depending on the nutritional changes we're making, it can be a really substantial impact.
It feels to me kind of like an insurance policy for that marginal decade, that last decade that we live, which we don't know when that decade begins. But
Sadly.
typically speaking, yeah, typically speaking, it's the worst. Our health in America, especially, just because that's where I know the studies from, the decline in our health span is so dramatic. We do this like dramatic fall off of health, whereas we want to make our health span match our
Yeah.
lifespan. Peter Attia talks about that, like squaring off the curve so that we live as healthy as we can. And I feel like this is the insurance policy for that. And it is so hard, really, to make changes right now. When I mean, I'm 49 and I'm like, I'm doing things today that I hope pay off when I'm 89.
Yeah.
It's a long-term goal. Like, you think generally long-term goals are like, "Oh, what's my 5-year plan or my like, no, we're talking like, what is your 50-year plan? I've decided I'm just gonna start adding in like one thing every once in a while. I'm just gonna start adding in one thing so that I'm not trying to overhaul. Because I mean, I still consider my diet pretty healthy, but I'm like, okay, I'm not eating beans. And so I planned something with beans like each week. And I'm like, once per week.
Yeah.
I mean, we're eating beans maybe 2 or 3 times a winter and like never in the summer. And so I can plan beans once per week and not have that be a huge issue. So I'm trying just anyway, that's just kind of a side note of just kind of like trying to
I would love to expand on
slowly.
that though.
Okay.
Because I think one of the really toxic messages we get from diet culture is like perfect or bust, right?
Oh yeah.
So we get this idea that like it only counts if you do it perfectly. And you need to go from 0 to 100 in zero point 0.6 seconds with diet changes, right? Like you go on a diet,
Yep.
right? You rip off the band-aid, you jump in with
You
both
have a
feet, right? You,
last
you
meal
just
on
do it all
Sunday
at
night.
once.
It's like last supper, and then Monday
Right.
morning, we're
And
like,
then
we're
Monday
all
morning,
in. Yeah.
and then again on Tuesday morning because I only made it to 3 p.m. on
Yeah.
Monday, right? Like, and so, here's the thing there's two things here. So first of all, when we're talking about long-term health outcomes, right? So we're talking about our risk of chronic disease as we age. We're talking about the things that are going to make, like I'm hoping as an 89-year-old that I'm still hiking 4 miles with my dog every morning,
Yeah.
right? And I can come home and lower myself onto the toilet seat without handlebars or help, right? Like I would love, and then I can call my hopefully grandkids or great grandkids at that time and have a really fascinating conversation about like some cool thing that I learned, right? Like these are my hopes
Mhm.
for my older years, right? Is that all of the things that give my life joy and fulfillment now are still the major parts of my life at 89. So what matters if I'm thinking about those long-term health outcomes is not how I eat today. I could have a perfect day. How I would argue a perfect day doesn't exist,
Right.
but let's just say it did. I eat perfectly today. That means not at all. Nothing. That is completely irrelevant for what my health is going to be in 50 years. What matters is how I eat on average over the next years and decades. So if I'm going to tackle change in such a way that I'm doing the yo-yo, I'm doing the on again, off again diet roller coaster. I'm great for 2 or 3 months, but I'm white knuckling it, right? And then I hit that moment of disinhibition where I'm at a birthday party, I have cake, right? This thing, I broke my rule. And then all of my health behaviors unravel. My average eating pattern when I am engaging with restrictive dieting, I'm engaging with the diet roller coaster, my average diet quality is pretty low. Even if I spend 2 months perfect, I'm going to spend 2 months or more really, really not perfect, right? So I actually want to tackle change in a way that is building lifelong healthy habits, right? Thinking about long-term eating patterns, not about seeking perfection today. I want to do whatever change is going to be the easiest change for me to build consistency with so I can get a win, so I can build off of that win and get that next win, right? And get that next success. So it's actually really important to figure out what is the way that I get to that endpoint, however long it takes, if it takes 5 years, if it takes 10 years, right? However long I get to that point where my overall eating patterns are really high quality, how do I get there in a way that I'm setting myself up for success? So one thing there is like necessarily not engaging in restriction. The other thing there is like taking it step by step, right? So what is this one change that I can make today? Which brings me to the other piece of this, right? The science says every little better choice counts, right? So we get about the same improvement in all-cause mortality, which is an indirect way of measuring overall health and longevity that scientists use to like figure out whether or not something is good or bad for us overall.
Mm-hmm.
We get the same reduction in all-cause mortality going from 0 servings of vegetables per day to 1 serving per day as we get from 1 to 4. Right? So
That's
sometimes
incredible.
those first steps,
Yeah.
it's the diminishing returns, right? So like I'm getting more of these nutrients that were really important as I get, going from 0 to, a quarter of these nutrients is a really big deal for all my biological systems that need these nutrients. Going from a quarter to a half is like, it's still great, but it's just not quite as great as going from 0 to 25, right? So it's just like we get slightly diminishing returns. This happens in biology all the time, right? We kind of just get these like exponential decay curves and U-shaped curves where like we have this happy medium range where our bodies are like, yay, this is the amount of all of this that I want. But we have this in nutrition over and over and over again, that that one first change going from 0 vegetables to 1 serving is so beneficial. Like, yes, we still want to get up to 5. Like
Sure.
that is still the goal. But if the starting point is 0, it's great to just work on 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really important habit to build. And that habit, building that into a habit, then gives us a baseline to build the next habit. So we do get a huge benefit, right? So there's some studies that look at 1 or 2 servings of legumes per week compared to 1 or 2 per month and still show like that's a huge health benefit, right? So
To get to one or two per
every
week.
little to get to 1 or 2 per week,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, 4 per week is better, sure. But, like, every little step is an important step, right? It's important for both the habit formation piece of it, but we're also gonna get, like, dividends. We're gonna get our health returns back on that effort. So, it's okay to say, what is my one thing? What is my one thing that I'm going to work on? I think it's really important, in my book and my, content on social media, on my website, I try to lay out where the science is at in terms of the most important eating patterns to help us reach our short-term health goals and support our long-term health. There's no timeline. Like, as you said, right? If we adopt a healthier diet at age 60, we still add on average 8 years to our life.
That's a
That's a
lot.
huge benefit.
That is
That's such a
that
huge
is so
benefit.
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
And that doesn't mean wait until you're 60.
no.
I would you want to make that very, very clear. That doesn't mean wait until you're 60. But it just shows us that it's much more important to set ourselves up to have long-term success than it is to try to rush into it and set ourselves up to engage in diet mentality and that yo-yo again.
So while we're like getting there, while we're like, okay, I'm just going to get up to one this week, or, I'm going to add in one new fruit or one new vegetable. Why do you want to get okay, what I'm trying to get at is, could we use supplements in the meantime?
Mm.
And why is it important to get our nutrients from food as opposed to supplements? I just want you to speak a little bit about supplements, because I can feel people just saying like, well, I take a multivitamin.
I mean, I guess the short answer is we could take supplements. I'm not anti-supplement. I am pro judicious and informed use of supplements.
Mm.
And the thing is with multivitamins as like nutritional insurance,
Mm-hmm.
which is how they're marketed to us and have been for nearly 100 years, is the science shows they don't work,
Mm.
right? The science shows there's no health signal from a multivitamin, at least not in the biggies, right? The big things that we would track, like all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence or mortality, or cancer incidence or mortality. There's some like niche health outcomes that we can look at, right? Like B complex vitamins can slow age-related cognitive decline, right? We already talked about some people need to supplement with vitamin D if they can't get sun exposure, right?
Mhm.
And it's really hard to get your vitamin D levels up from food sources alone. I'm a vitamin D supplemental person,
Take vitamin D.
and
Yeah.
I hike outside 4 miles every morning, right? So, like, some people just need it, and it's okay. But you would expect that if a multivitamin was really working as nutritional insurance, that you would see the signal in cardiovascular disease, in cancer, in all-cause mortality. And we don't. We have many different clinical trials, so much so that there's many different systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which are our highest quality scientific evidence, that just show nothing.
Hmm.
Bupkis. No measurable benefit from a multivitamin. And in fact, a couple of times where maybe a multivitamin could potentially be harmful. I don't want to scare people away from a multivitamin, but high calcium intake, so like over the recommended dietary allowance, like over like 1,200, 1,300 milligrams of calcium from supplements does start to tick up increased risk for kidney stones.
Mm.
And there is a little bit of a signal in some meta-analyses in cancer incidence, but that's more studies required to understand if that's a real effect or not. So overall, as long as you're not overdoing calcium from a multivitamin's not going to do any harm. But it's if our choice is to, especially because multivitamins, I mean, you can still get the cheap ones, but the ones that were sold online are getting more and more expensive.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So if you're looking at that $300 a month multivitamin supplement sold by your favorite wellness influencer, or $300 more to spend a month on Whole Foods, the science says when we get those nutrients from foods, we do get the expected health benefit. When we get those nutrients from a multivitamin, we don't. What's fascinating is there's not a really good answer for why. Like, well, why doesn't a multivitamin work if
Especially
I know if I get those nutrients from food?
the ones that are marketed as like, these are food-based. Like, I've seen those, like food-based supplements, or I don't know what they call them, but
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, they're
sure.
telling you,
And
they make you think that they're not like synthetic.
right. They might be better. They haven't been studied. I mean, that's the
Mm.
other thing is there's a lot of like really fancy supplements, like really small supplement companies making claims that they can't back up with scientific studies, right? So like
Mhm.
is one of those greens powders that's supposed to have 100% of everything that you need for the day, is that going to be as good as your 5 servings of vegetables? I can't tell you. I don't think so. Probably not. But I don't have a scientific study to point to say yay or nay, and neither do the companies
Yeah.
making those claims.
Right.
So, so there's some good explanations that are it's probably a combination of the things. So we know, especially when our multivitamins are tablets, that those are very poorly dissolved in our digestive tract. They dissolve too far down the chain, that a lot of the opportunity for nutrient absorption has been missed, right? So like the receptors for bringing those nutrients into the body, we're higher up. And now that the nutrients are actually liberated from the tablet, there's no receptors down there, and it just goes out the other end.
If they even dissolve at all. Like, if you want to hear like
Right.
a kind of a gross anecdote.
Let's do it. We're going to talk about poop now.
Yeah.
This is good. We're friends.
We totally are.
We're officially friends. Yeah.
My brother is a wastewater engineer. And when he was young and like early on in his career, now he like owns his own, engineering firm and is the big boss. And when he was a wee baby engineer, he had to do site visits. And so he's like, you know what's in the tanks? This is what floats in the tanks: condoms and vitamins. That's what I see the most of. And it's not because people are flushing their vitamins. We're just pooping them out. Like,
they're just going all the way through.
Yeah. So don't, if you are going to see if a vitamin can help you feel better, for sure, no tablets, because those will just just pass right through.
Yeah, definitely capsule form. If you do want to take a multivitamin. So some of the other possible explanations besides the it just took the long way through, as opposed to the shorter way of just dumping them down the toilet. Other possible explanations is it might not be enough, right? The way that most multivitamins are formulated, it might not be making up enough difference to see that signal.
Which is probably why vitamin D works, because you can get a pretty high dose of vitamin D. Because I have seen my blood levels of vitamin D come up with supplementation.
Yeah. Yes. Well, also the standard protocol, now not every doctor is going to do this, but the standard protocol is to retest your vitamin D levels, right? So some doctors, my doctor, when we were first getting my vitamin D in range, retested every 3 months. And now I test about every 6 months. Other doctors will just test once a year when you get your annual blood work yet, but there will be a follow-up. At which point they'll say, well, are you taking your vitamin D? Because your levels are still low, right? And then you'll go, yeah, no, I'm taking how much you said. And they'll say, okay, we'll double it, right? So like there will be some kind of follow-up where your dose is adjusted. And depending on your doctor, it might be like more frequent follow-up and more intentional dosing. And with some doctors, it might be a little bit more of an afterthought. But we do kind of have this like standard protocol of testing vitamin D levels and figuring out an individualized dose per person that can range anywhere from 400 IU per day, 2,000 is more typical for people with deficiency, up to 10,000 IU per day, right? Like that is the kind of range of what people need to get their vitamin D levels in check. Whereas we don't even have tests for every other nutrient, right? You can't take your serum potassium and think that that's measuring the potassium levels in your body. All that's measuring is how well your kidneys are functioning, right? So, because your kidneys control how much potassium's in your blood, you can have low potassium in your blood from low intake of potassium, but low intake of potassium in your blood is more likely a measurement of kidney shenanigans than it is of potassium intake. So we don't even have tests for every nutrient. A lot of the tests that we do have are only done under very specific circumstances, right? Like you're anemic and taking this iron supplement hasn't worked. Therefore, now we'll test for the other types of anemia, right? Like then we're going to measure your folate, your vitamin B12 levels, right? And then see if it's a different type of anemia than iron deficiency anemia. So one of the challenges here is we don't, other than for vitamin D, we don't have protocols for figuring out how much somebody needs of specific nutrients. It's just there's like a standard amount that's put into a capsule or a tablet, and that's what's given. The other thing is there's lots of nutrients that aren't formulated into multivitamins, right? So like 95% of people don't get enough dietary fiber, which is a technically non-essential nutrient. So it's not in my statistic of 4 essential nutrients for which 90% or more of Americans don't get enough of from their diet. But there's no fiber in vitamins typically, right? Even a green supplement, you might get a gram.
And I'm like, I cannot choke it down. Like, so fiber supplements I've tried several and I'm like, nope, no, I cannot.
The other, the other thing about fiber supplements is it's a little bit like a fiber monocrop for our gut bacteria.
Yeah.
So we have certain gut bacteria that do not care They'll eat whatever we eat. They're fine. There's one called Bacteroides. Oh, it's like theta zeta omicron or something like that. That's not it, but it's just like a bunch of Greek letters that are just like put together in a word. And that bacteria, it doesn't care. It will live no matter what we feed it. And then we've got all these other like really,
Picky ones.
picky eaters of gut bacteria that are really important species. Like a lot of the bifidobacterium that are like some of the most important probiotics that we want to grow in our gut. They're like, I only eat this one type of fiber. So they're super picky. And then we've got, right, like, so a normal, like healthy human gut microbiome would have like 500 to 1500 different species of bacteria. About 30 or 40 of them are like the multitaskers and the rest are picky eaters. And some of them, they don't even want to eat what we eat. They want to eat other bacteria's poop. It's called bacteria cross-feeding. And so we have to feed the picky eater the thing so that the other picky eater can eat the picky eater's metabolic byproducts.
Wow.
So so that community requires us to eat a diversity of fiber types, which means not just like your cellulose and your hemicellulose and your lignin and your chitin, right? Like your beta glucans. It means there's hundreds of different types of cellulose, right? So like it means the small differences that we get when we get our fiber from whole food. So if you take a fiber supplement, right, there's only a few, right, it's probably psyllium husk or it's inulin fiber or it's like resistant starch, right? Like it's really only those things. It's one type of fiber for like maybe there's another 50 bacteria that'll like that type of fiber, but what about the few hundred others that wanted the sweet potato or the broccoli or the apple, right? Like there's the way that we get those small differences in fiber type that feed the individual species of bacteria is by getting our fiber from whole foods. So that doesn't mean there's always a time and a place for supplements, right? If you're talking about, kids with sensory processing disorder or autism spectrum and have really, really strong sensory aversions, they're going to need fiber in order to regulate gastric motility in order to not have chronic constipation. Like that's a different situation, right? This is where we talk about the informed and judicious use of supplements. But for the average person, it is vastly superior to get our fiber from whole foods than it is to get it from a supplement.
Well, that's good because I'm about to throw that fiber supplement away because I've tried. So I just have permission now. I'm just going to toss that.
Yep.
But that reminds me too, in your book, you talk about getting a certain number of species per week. And I was I remember I was on a walk when I was listening to it and I paused it and I started counting on my fingers. I'm like, okay, what have I had this week? And I was trying to count. I'm like, I got to do this with paper and pencil. But that's kind of different than you also have like 12 nutritionally distinct food families. And I wasn't sure like how those relate. And like, so tell us about like getting the species, because that's going to point towards also the different fiber. But then there's also, you have distinct food families, nutritionally distinct.
Yeah. So there's actually 3 overlapping concepts here.
Okay.
So one is like eat the rainbow. One is your, like, I call them Nutrivore foundational foods, but they're like specific food families that have something unique to offer us nutritionally. And then one is high dietary diversity. And it's, I think, really helpful to have all of them on your radar, but they don't necessarily all need to be a focus, right? Like we can break this up into our baby steps again. So high dietary diversity literally just refers to eating a lot of different whole foods, right? So it's just a diet that has a wide representation of different types of foods in it. My favorite study that measured this was from 2022. They followed nearly 500,000 people living in 9 European countries for an average of 10 years.
Wow.
And they measured dietary diversity using something called dietary species richness. So it was the number of different species of plant or animal represented in the diet over the course of a year. So the other studies measure dietary diversity other ways. They look at per day or per week or per month, or they'll do like a weird way of like counting food groups instead of counting individual foods. Like there's lots of different ways of getting at this question. But what this study showed was that the people who consumed 81 or more different species of foods over the course of a full year had a 38% reduced risk of all-cause mortality compared to the people who consumed 48 or fewer. 38%, so that's roughly almost 4 years of additional health span and lifespan on average. Like we can roughly translate a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality to an extra year of life. But that's a bigger impact than any food. It's like any like meeting a, like that highest level of intake of a health promoting food, your highest are going to be like vegetables and nuts and seeds. So those are in your like 25 to 30% reduction in all-cause mortality range. So 38% is higher magnitude. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one is diversity of food equals diversity of nutrients, right? Diversity of fiber types. Just eating a bunch of different foods reduces the chances of having a really important nutrient shortfall in an essential nutrient. The other thing, though, is it protects us from overdoing something that is harmful in large quantities, right? So ideally, we wouldn't get more than 10% of our calories from added sugar. We wouldn't get more than 10% of our calories from saturated fat. We don't want to get more than like 5-ish grams or 4.5-ish grams of sodium per day. There's additives and preservatives that in moderation are absolutely fine. They're health neutral, but we don't want to exceed the acceptable dietary intake levels of those. So when we have a diversity of foods, we're also protected from overdoing something that might be harmful to our health in large quantities.
So sorry,
dietary diversity.
Let me just ask a question here real quick. On the species, that's everything from like a carrot, an orange, and chicken, right? So it counts. It's not just produce. We're talking about,
right.
But whereas like milk, like yogurt and cheese and cottage cheese, would that be one species?
Technically in this study.
Okay.
So not only that, like broccoli and kale are the same species. So like even that would have been, so like half of the cruciferous vegetables we consume are all the same species. Brassica oelaceae.
Oh, that's really too bad for my counting.
Yes. Okay. So technically this study looked at species.
Okay.
But when we're not just implementing the insight from this one study, we're implementing the insight from the field. So when we look at the field as a whole, we see that every little thing counts, right? So you can absolutely count your broccoli and kale. You can count your orange carrots, your purple carrots, and your yellow carrots in your bag of rainbow carrots. You can count your different varieties of apples. You can count your chicken thigh and your chicken breast. So I'm just trying to figure out how to have a diverse diet. Every little bit, every tiny bit counts. And okay, so then the other thing is this study showed that total dietary diversity mattered. That was not like a signal from just vegetables, right? It wasn't that dietary diversity of vegetables mattered and that because they were looking at total dietary diversity, they saw that signal. They were basically saying, no, it's across the board. It matters across all food groups. There are other studies that just look at diversity of like plant foods. There was a study out of the Human Gut Project published in 2016 or 18, a few years ago, that showed that the people who consumed 30 or more different plant foods per week had substantially healthier gut microbiomes than people who consumed 10 or fewer. But they didn't look at all of the steps in between. So like, where is the actual cusp? Is it 22? Is it 28? Is it actually 30? I can't tell you based on that study. So if we look at the field as a whole, I think we can make a really strong case for 30 to 35 different foods per week. But that is subject to change. We need more science to really say, like, what is the threshold here? But that also means if you count up, that is exactly the activity that I recommend people do when they're working on dietary diversity. Just count up everything that you ate last week. See where you're starting at. Is it 15? Awesome. Let's add 2 things next week. Let's try a different type of apple, right? Or a different, there's so many different citrus fruits this time of year. Let's just swap out something like that, right? Do something easy.
That's why I like the one like by the year, because right now my Satsuma mandarins on my tree are ripe, and I have been weighing them actually because I was like, I wonder what my crop is this year because it's been kind of a small tree and growing. And turns out I realized I'm like the only one that eats them because citrus gives my husband heartburn, and my daughter says they're too soft. They were fine the first day I picked them. Now they're too soft. So I have eaten roughly 20 pounds of mandarins in the last month.
Those are the best citrus.
Yeah,
they are so yummy. Unequivocally.
But like, It's the
Yeah, they're
only
my
time
favorite.
they grow here. They're a different variety that we grow here in Northern California than what you can get in like, they're not like those cuties. Those are yummy, but, like, this is
Yeah.
a different one.
No, but a Satsuma
Yeah,
mandarin, mwah,
so good.
chef's kiss.
So, it's like this month, like, I get Satsuma mandarins this month and a half, like, sometimes 6 weeks,
Yep.
very short-lived, and then not for the rest of the year. And so, like, the rest of the year, I eat, apples and grapes, and then in the summer, I'm like, all the melons and all the peaches and the
Yeah.
nectarines, and so I like that, like, for the year because I'm very much a seasonal eater because it's how I grew up, and I do have the opportunity to grow some of my own food, and I do have access here to local farms and produce and things, and so, which I know everyone doesn't have that option, but just eating seasonally, I like thinking of, like, that 81 for the year because
Yeah.
that helps me realize, like, I do have a lot more variety than I think if I just, like, think about more than just this
Mhm.
week.
Well, and I think that that's the other way to interpret this body of scientific literature is the benefits of eating seasonally, right? And the benefits of that shift and eating, when we're eating seasonally, we tend to be eating more locally grown produce, which there's not a ton of nutrition data for me to point to. So it's probably more nutrient dense, but probably not by a huge meaningful amount.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about every little bit counting, like, why not? That's one concept, right? It's dietary diversity. The other related concept is eat the rainbow. So there are 5 color families that we divide. We could divide, actually, we can put all plant foods in here. It's mainly going to be fruits and vegetables because there's not a whole lot of color among
The
like
greens.
legumes or nuts and
Yeah.
seeds and whole grains, but those can count if we want to. But it's red, orange and yellow,
Mhm.
green, blue and purple, and white and brown. And the reason why we divide it into those color families is that that's how we can like categorize the phytonutrients that are giving fruits and vegetables and other plant foods their distinctive colors. So we have certain patterns that tend to make something red or tend to make something orange to yellow or tend to make something blue to purple. And so those groups of phytonutrients act differently in our body, right? So we have different health benefits from different collections of phytonutrients. So when we are eating the rainbow and we're getting all 5 color families, we have more like health benefit from doing that. That is independently beneficial above and beyond eating enough fruits and vegetables. So that's kind of a way at getting at dietary diversity, but you could have a diverse diet and not be getting all 5 colors of the rainbow, but you could be also getting all 5 colors of the rainbow and getting that from 5 different foods and not having a diverse diet,
Right.
right?
Okay.
So we kind of want to have both of those ideas in mind. And then that's where Nutrivore foundational foods kind of also plug in. So these are the 12 food families that each have something unique to offer us nutritionally or are like that's the collection of nutrients they have that we can technically get from other foods, but the way that these foods have them together and in high amounts, it expedites the process of meeting our nutritional needs from the foods we eat, which is the whole point of Nutrivore. So those food families, right? They're not non-negotiable. We can absolutely negotiate them. If there's a food family that you hate or are allergic to or doesn't align with a dietary template that you really love, that's okay. But what they do in that case is identify the need for either like really conscientiously looking for where else am I going to get those nutrients? And maybe there's the need for a supplementation strategy, right? So one of the Nutrivore foundational foods is seafood, fish and shellfish. The main nutrient that seafood is giving us that kind of elevates it to foundational food status. It's seafood is like double to quintuple the nutrient density of most typical meats that you would get in the grocery store, and double to triple the nutrient density of most plant proteins. So like seafood is just crazy nutrient dense, about equal to organ meat in terms of its nutrient density. But the main thing that's like, aha, that's it gets to be a foundational food is the long chain omega-3 fats, DHA and EPA, which are crazy important for neurological health, cardiovascular health, and immune health, right? And then if something's good for those, they're good for
Yeah.
everything, right? Because we can't have the health of our digestive system if we don't have immune health or neurological health or cardiovascular health, right? And so, if you are, say, allergic to fish and shellfish, they are 2 of the top 8 allergens after all. What that being a foundational food means for you is you need to go, okay, what is the thing that I'm not getting because I'm not eating this food? Can I get this from anywhere else? So you can get some from like sea vegetables. So, maybe eating the seaweed salad more frequently. There's a few, like purslane is a vegetable that is, you need to grow it yourself, but it does have some omega-3s in it, right? So like finding those other food sources here and there that have some, or you go, okay, I need a supplement strategy. In this case, it would be algal oil, would be your vegan long chain omega-3 fat, non-allergen, that you could consume, right? So the foundational foods have something each unique to offer us, right? So in vegetables, we've got 5 vegetable families that all have something special. So cruciferous vegetables, the cabbage family, have a class of phytonutrients called glucosinolates that we can't get from any other food that are particularly important for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer. They're some of our most cancer preventive compounds we can get from our diet. Alliums, the onion family, have a class of phytonutrients called thiosulfonates. Thiosulfonates are also protective against cancer and cardiovascular disease in ways that are complementary to glucosinolates. So ideally, we would get both. We can't get thiosulfonates from any other food family. We've got mushrooms, which have so many different things that are unique. But the coolest thing they have is an amino acid called ergothioneine, which is not used to make protein in our body, but it has lots of other things that it does. And it's a very strong antioxidant. It reduces risk of all of the diseases associated with aging. So much so, it has been nicknamed by scientists the longevity vitamin. Extremely hard to get ergothioneine from other foods. Then we get root vegetables and leafy vegetables. They each basically, it's because of the types of fiber they have. Leafy vegetables also are our best food sources of vitamin K. So those are just 5 out of the 12 foundational food families. But I use them as an example because of the conversation of dietary diversity and eat the rainbow, because you could be eating the rainbow and missing out on cruciferous vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
You could have a diverse diet and be missing out on alliums, right? So the idea is like, it's 3 different ways of thinking about food choice in terms of like having more coverage of nutrients, right? Like that is the goal of all 3 of those eating patterns. And ideally, they'd sort of all 3 of them would be on our radar, right? All 3 of them would be something we're kind of thinking about. I want to make sure I'm getting my 12 foundational food coverage. I want to make sure I'm getting my Eat the Rainbow coverage. I want to make sure I'm getting my dietary diversity coverage. Emphasizing again, we don't need to go from 0 to 100 in 0.6 seconds. And because it is a lot to think about, I have created tools for keeping track and for like nutrient targets. So I have something called the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix. It is in my book. So if you get my book, it is in there, and it's got all of these different things in it, like as a checklist. So really, really easy to keep track. But then you've also got all of the whys behind each part. And I also have a digital product on my website called the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix, if you would prefer that. And if you want to just like dip your toes, I have one of the free guides that you get when you sign up for my weekly newsletter is called Nutrivore Foundational Foods. So it is just like lists of those 12 food families, how much of them we want to aim to eat per day or per week, and example foods. And you can find that at Nutrivore.com/join. So I've tried to, I know it's a lot to keep track of. I know it can be overwhelming. So I've tried to create different resources to make that part easy, because again, the goal is lifelong healthy habits, not I'm setting myself up to yo-yo. We want to get off, no more yo-yo.
No more yo-yo.
Yo-yo bad.
Okay. This has been so amazing, so informative. I'm just like sitting here staring like, yes, keep talking. That's so good. I'm going to put all of your links, all of those links for the things you just talked about in the show notes. Obviously, the link to your book as well. Again, I highly recommend it. And she's a delight. Also, she reads the book herself. So if you like the audio, I love audiobooks, so I listen to those a lot. Dr. Sarah and I have realized we just have so much to talk about. Bonus, we are going to do another episode next week, so tune in for that, and we will see you next week. I'm so glad you tuned in today. If today's insights resonated with you and you're ready to make lasting changes in your health journey, I'd love to help. First, don't forget to check out the Jumpstart Your Weight Loss program to get you going this year. You can also book a free strategy session to see if my full 12-week one-on-one coaching program is right for you. You can schedule it at the link in the show notes. Remember, it's not just about the food, it's about empowering yourself with choices that truly serve you. Have a great week, and as always, thanks for listening to the Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well podcast.